The Bible is a unusual book. It just tells things as it is. That's just the way it is. You go and you study different things in the Bible. You find Adam and Eve betrayed God. We find Esau and Jacob. You see the different things in the Bible. You see about Judah. Judah had married an ungodly woman. He had 3 ungodly children, as far as we can tell, from a Canaanite woman. 2 of them God killed. He had picked a wife out for him, Tamar. And they were wicked. And then after Judah's wife dies, his son, the last son he had, he wasn't going to give her to Tamar because he thought that God would kill him. And so he withheld him from her. And she was getting older, and she needed to have a child to take care of her, because there wasn't Social Security or welfare or socialism or anything back in those days. So she deceived him because he was vulnerable. He chased prostitutes, basically, and he thought he had one. That he went there on the way to his sheep shearers and saw this temple prostitute. He thought, this is a pagan temple prostitute, he thought she was. And it was his daughter-in-law instead. And he promised her pay if she would sleep with him. And she did. And he gave her his signet ring, his belt, and his staff for security until she was paid. And then she came up pregnant. His daughter-in-law, Tamar, came up pregnant, and he was going to have her burned alive. And he said, what man, who are you having this child with? And she said, the guy that owns this ring, this staff, and this belt. And he said, you are more righteous than I am. The Bible puts that down. The Bible put down when David and Bathsheba. When David, Uriah the Hittite was David's personal bodyguard, basically. And he had him killed because he was having an affair with his wife. And he wouldn't go to her. He was a very righteous man. Uriah the Hittite was. He's a Hittite. Wasn't really. He was adopted into the family of Israel. Well, David marries her, Bathsheba, and then a child comes forth and God kills the child. You know the story about that. That's Solomon and his wonderful, wonderful brilliance, and yet he was a reprobate, so to speak, later in his life. Horrible story of drug addiction and alcoholism and all with Solomon. It just tells you the story. And then we come to the New Testament. And it tells stories there, and here's one story that is kind of wild, but it really happened. The story is the price of a belly dancer, an exotic dancer. Now, when I was growing up in school in the 1940s and 50s, there was a lot of poor people in Bakersfield, California, and even up here in this valley, where I went to school here too. But one there I was related by marriage to this one family, and there was about 10 of them, and they were really living in rags. They lived in a one-room house. And I mean, barely had any food. They had lice on them, everything. They were just in really terrible shape. There was no hygiene or anything, wasn't capable of it. And I remember the boys and the girls that I went there, and they were my cousins, you know, by marriage. And I just felt so sorry for them. I was poor, boy, living in a shack with a dirt floor and no door, and a flap for a door and a screen for a window, and no running water or anything. They didn't have it either, except there was a bunch of them. Well, when the girls got up, they were always teased them, you know, because they wore rags. And shoes, if they had shoes, they didn't even have shoes half the time. And I felt sorry for them. And the girls grew up and they became exotic dancers. One of them married into Washington, D.C., into a politician. They used their abilities and their beauty, which, I mean, they had been teased all their life, ugly ducklings and mud fences and whatever, but when they really cleaned up and everything, they were very pretty. And they used that ability to support. They supported their mother and everything. I'm not saying that's good, but I knew them very well. Here we have an example of that in the Bible. And then we're going to read here the story of it in the 14th chapter of the Katamathion, the Gospel according to Matthew. At time Herod the Tetrarch, Antipas basically, heard that the news about Jesus hasn't risen from the dead. Oh, wait a minute. Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said that his servants, this is John the Baptist, has risen from the dead, and that is the miraculous powers are at work in him. Now he's afraid. He's got a real bad conscience. Real bad conscience. And Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. Philip the Tetrarch, the ruler of a quarter of the empire. Herod the Great ruled all of it, but then his sons it was divided up. Now, Herod used to like to hear John the Baptist preach, but John the Baptist preach laid it on him. But he had put John the Baptist in prison for safekeeping, protective custody is what he did, because his wife was trying to hire somebody to kill him. And she was going to kill him. Now what she did afterwards and what she did and planned on doing here, you know, she was a kind of a flirt, and definitely a flirt, and a what we might call a loose woman. Herod seized John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. For John had been saying to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. She left him for a better, more money, a higher esteem, etc., etc. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they regarded him as a prophet. Now, Herodias trained her daughter to be a belly dancer and a prostitute. You find in history people have done things like this. You know that a lot of the Jewish women in Europe, many of them, one of the great, what we call actors, they went all over the world. I think she had 3 sisters, and their mother had trained all of them to be courtesans. A courtesan is a high-class prostitute. She had even had a child by a prince of Bohemia or something. And she came to America. She appeared on the stage all over the place, Sarah Bernhardt. And, but her mother had trained them to be prostitutes. Wherever the Jews went, there was persecution. And if you got some pretty girls in there and you sent them in there, and a courtesan was somebody that was really highly educated, they had musical abilities, and they were good lovers. And that's what she trained her daughters to be, so they could go in these areas and they would get involved with rulers so they could be protected. And that's what Sarah Bernhardt's family did. And now it says, and Herod's birthday came, and the daughter of Herodias danced before them, and it pleased Herod. A whole lot. She was up there, she was a belly dancer, and everybody was all excited and everything. This beautiful girl's up there, and she is fantastic belly dancer. You know, you can hire exotic dancers for birthday parties and everything, even in America today. And Herod did it 2,000 years ago. And when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased him, and thereupon he promised with an oath to give whatever price she had for her talents. Just tell me what you want. Name it. Name the price of the belly dancer. This is one of those stories in the Bible that it blows you away. God just tells the story. That's what happened. Thereupon he promised with an oath to give her what she ever asked. Now the price of this belly dancer, up to half of his kingdom and 1/4 of all Palestine. That's what he told her. And having been prompted by her mother, she was trained by her mother. Like Sarah Bernhardt's mother, she was trained to be a prostitute. And the price was, Herod could not protect John the Baptist. He had him in protective custody. This woman was involved with the Sicarii, everything you can think of. Having been prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." What a gruesome, horrible thing. Mm-hmm. Although he was grieved, he was crying his eyes out. Now he went from sexual arousement and excitement to depression. The oath, the price of the belly dancer, the price of the exotic dancer. Although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests. He had made this promise in front of witnesses. Now all she wanted was a head. She didn't want 1/4 of the empire of Palestine. All she wanted was John the Baptist's head, but that was the price of eternity. Herod had been convicted of sin, righteous, and judgment to come many times by this man, and he put him in the jail for protective custody, away from his wife, and now she finds a way to get to him. And it's the price of the belly dancer. And he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine this gruesome trophy? Well, most women would have vomited seeing something like this. Yeah. But you have to go back to the period of time right then. You know, his father had built a hippodrome there in Jerusalem. That's where they had these games and the horse races. And back in those days, it was like, I don't like the game of football. I know it's going to really, really upset some of you out there. I've never watched a football game in my life. I think it's a game of destruction and human life and disabilities. I think it's not good. I like baseball. That's a good American sport. But anyway, it's like gladiators. Gladiators go out there and some of the hockey games, you know, get out there and they don't go to see the hockey game, they go to see the fights in the hockey game. They want to see bloodshed. Bloodshed. Blood sports. Well, they were pitting men against wild beasts against each other, and they wanted to saw blood and guts. The excitement of determination of lives. Everything has a spirit and everything has a soul. And they delighted in that. I mean, in executions were attended by thousands of people. They wanted to see somebody die. I remember when Benjamin Marcus Bogard, one of the greatest Baptist preachers in the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. Benjamin Marcus Bogard, and I know you don't know this unless you've heard me tell these stories before. My family were Indians, but some of the Indians married into other people, into Anglo-Saxons, Irish, and Germans, and whatever, you know. English, Scots. Part of my family, well, one of my grandfather's twin sister married into an outlaw family. You look at the Jameses and the Daltons and the Youngers, they were all cousins, by the way. My great aunt was Liddy Dalton. Liddy Dalton. Married into one of the Daltons. The one she married to was not an outlaw. There were some of the Daltons that weren't outlaws. Middleton Dalton wasn't. Littleton wasn't. But the Daltons and Youngers and the Jameses were caused to go into outlawry because they were on the Confederate side. They weren't originally. The Daltons and the Youngers, the Youngers especially, were not. They were Union sympathizers, and their father had a contract with the mail. He had 7 ranches and farms, and they would support it down the biggest part. They were raising horses for the stage routes and run the mail. Well, on one of these stage routes, the father was there, and the Union soldiers came up, and he had $7,500 on him, and they stole his money, and they killed him and shot him down blood. Just premeditated murder. Then they went and took every horse, burned all of his homes down, and down to the finally one where they burned his wife's home down with her standing out in the snow. And that was a stroke that turned them into the South. So the Youngers joined the Southern Confederate Army. And after the war, the Youngers, the James, and the Daltons could not go back into civilian life. I know you knew, your mother knew one of the Daltons up there. He was a brick mason and was in Lebec, California. They went to California. They went all over trying to hide out. Finally, the Youngers decided to rob that bank. Now, the James and the Youngers and the Daltons never rode together. I don't care how many movies you see with them there. They weren't there. The Jameses weren't there with them. The Youngers decided to rob this bank, Northfield, Minnesota, and they were going to take the money because the president of that bank had been the one that killed their father and stole his money, and all the money, all their family fortune was gone. They were going to go down and go and move into Mexico or Cuba or something and get out of the United States because they knew they couldn't stay here. Well, they shot them up. The James boys got away because they weren't there. As simply as that. If you want to read the story, read Cole Younger by Cole Younger. And he'll tell you what happened there. Cole Younger became a preacher, by the way. Matter of fact, the James boys, their father was a missionary Baptist preacher, and he founded 5 missionary Baptist churches. And where the Jameses went, the missionary Baptist churches would support them, wherever they were. And they'd go there and they'd stay, and what they do is the carpetbaggers went into the South. You don't hear the other side of this story. What I'm telling you right now, is not in history books. But my family was there. The Jameses, the railroads, and the banks came in and confiscated farm after farm after farm. The Jameses go out and rob a train or a bank and go pay the mortgages off and go from church to church. And they also, part of the Golden Circle, they were going to move all their money and go into some other country where they could live. Well, Jesse James and Frank James came to visit Benjamin Marcus Bogart's house when he was a little boy. We're going to go back to this story now. And Jesse James slept in the bed with Ben Bogart. You know, they did that back then. Now it's, weird. But back then, I mean, when I grew up, I slept 3 and 4 people to a a little single bed. Your feet were going back in each other's face and everything else. That's the way it was, people. But anyway, Bogart's father was a deacon in a missionary Baptist church, and there were Southern missionary Baptist churches at that time. All Southern Baptist churches were missionary Baptist churches. And he saw him lay there with that big gun on his belt, or on his belly at night time, and he would come up and he wanted to be an outlaw. He wanted to be a Robin Hood too. I know it's a long story getting back to what we're going. We're going there. Well, anyway, Ben Bogart's father was really upset with this, even though he had a lot of respect for Frank and Jesse James, because what they had done and what they'd been through. They knew the other side of the story. They knew the carpetbaggers. They knew what happened. Anyway, so Ben Bogart's father decided to take him to a hanging, a public hanging. This man had raped a woman and then killed her and killed her husband. It was a double, in other words, a double death penalty. And he was a great big guy, and a giant of a man. And Bogart was down there. There was, I think, 1,000 or 10,000, I can't remember now, 1,000 or 10,000 people at this hanging. And they were all around, and Bogart brought his son up there right in the front, so he could see this hanging, because he figured this would cure his lust for being an outlaw, even if it was a Robin Hood outlaw. So they took the man out there, and this Catholic priest came out there, and little Ben, he knew Catholicism wasn't going to get you to heaven. And he looked at this formality of this, and he said, "Dad, that's not going to get him to heaven. He's not going to go to heaven. This isn't going to work." He gave him the last rites and put his evergreen sprig in his pocket and all this kind of stuff, and then he began to walk up the 13 steps to the gallows. And he turned around and he said, "I'm going to tell you something. I killed that man, and I raped that woman, and I killed her. But you didn't convict me, because there were no witnesses, and you didn't do it right. Somebody had to lie to get me here." And the court should have been a hung jury, but I was prosecuted unjustly, even though I did it. And I did it. And I have no remorse for it. And he walked up there, this great giant of a man. They pulled a rope around his neck and pulled a hood down over his head and tripped the well, the trap door through the well of the floor, and it broke the rope. And he was down there strangling. And since this was, usually when a man lives through a hanging, it's an act of God that saved his life, but not this time. It's a double murder. So they threw a lariat up over the top of that gallows, ran it down through that floor, and several men got out there and pulled him up there while he was wetting his pants and scrolling and screaming. And that cured Ben Bogart's desire to be an outlaw, because he saw what the gallows was. He became a Baptist preacher and preached more sermons than, I think, for 65 years without ever missing a sermon on a Sunday. Ripley, believe it or not, even wrote him up. Let's get back to the story now. It's brought the price. The price. The price of the belly dancer. He said that because of this oath, because of his dinner guests, he sent and had John the Baptist beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. What a gruesome trophy.
Yeah.
People back then wanted to see blood, like they did in the Colosseums of Rome, when they put the bulls against the bears, and they put the humans, they take a Christian out there and give him a sword and turn a bear or a lion or leopards loose in the pen with him, or a bear or whatever, and watch them torn to pieces and eaten. Horrible, horrible lust for blood. That's the kind of woman that Herodias was. And that's the kind of girl that her daughter was. And his disciples came and took away the body. And they buried it. And they went and reported all things to Jesus. Now when Jesus had heard it, he withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place by himself. And when the multitudes heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. Jesus would face a horrible, gruesome death because of religious rivalry. Jesus was the Messiah, King of Israel, without doubt, and had every proof, and they wanted to see him die on the cross, and that was the most gruesome, slow death that any man could ever suffer. Because they didn't want him to take their power away from them. And guess what? Their power was taken away from them. The person that they asked to be released, Barabbas. Barabbas was part of the Sicarii. He was part of the Jewish assassins. They say that some of these that escaped went and founded the Isle of Sicily, the Sicilian banquets, the mafioso, the Jewish mafioso. Those insurrectionists, there were 3 of them going to be crucified. And the leader of the band was Barabbas, son of the Father. And they said, give it, and Pontius Pilate knew all that happened with John the Baptist, knew everything that happened here. He knew all about this. He wasn't ignorant of what was going on or ignorant of their devices. So he said, surely this guy has gone out, he has kidnapped their daughters, kidnapped their religious leaders, done all this kind of stuff, and they will not want him to be released. He was a part of the group at Masada. That wasn't a good group either. They were the ones going out and killing the Roman soldiers. It caused the whole city of Jerusalem to be razed to the ground because of the decisions that they had made. They made this bloody decision to crucify the Messiah, King of Israel. And their blood would be upon them. That's what they said, you know. And Pontius Pilate said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. They said, his blood be upon us and our children. And boy, has it happened. So many times. The Holocaust. All of the things through Israel. All of the Sarah Bernhardts through Europe. All of the courtesans. All the things that come down to us today. The blood. Let his blood be upon us and our children. And the price of a belly dancer. Our Father, we send this message out. Your word is so true, so plain, so brilliant. I don't think in any false religion in this world, Father, that they would write down the things that you've written down in your book. They'd want it to be crystal squeaky clean, and you just tell it like it is. Father, use this message to bring those in the world to you, to your Son as their Savior. And please forgive me where I fail you. In Jesus' name I pray.